Picture this, it's August 1944. You're a young German soldier who just spent months fighting in the scorching deserts of North Africa under Field Marshal Rommel. You've heard the propaganda back home, stories about how America is weak, decadent, a nation of soft people who couldn't possibly match the industrial prowess of the Third Reich. Then you're captured. You're put on a Liberty ship, expecting the worst. But instead of starvation rations, you're served meals more substantial than anything you've eaten in months. The ship itself is massive, churning across the Atlantic at remarkable speed. And when you finally dock in New York Harbor, what you see makes your jaw drop. Skyscrapers pierce the clouds. Cars, thousands of them, crowd the streets. The docks are teeming with ships being loaded and unloaded at a pace you've never witnessed. Everything is untouched by war. No rubble. No bomb craters. Just abundance. Then they put you on something called a Pullman car, a luxury train carriage with cushioned seats and windows that let you watch America roll past. Mile after mile, hour after hour, the landscape continues undamaged. Factories belch smoke in every direction. Farms stretch to the horizon. And slowly, terrifyingly, the truth begins to dawn on you. Everything you were told was a lie. Welcome to the story of how hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war came face to face with American industrial might, and how that encounter would reshape their understanding of the war, democracy, and the future itself. Between 1942 and 1945, more than 400,000 German prisoners of war were shipped to the United States. Let that number sink in. 400,000. That's roughly the population of a decent-sized city, all arriving on American shores as prisoners of a nation they'd been taught to despise. But why were they here at all? The story begins across the Atlantic. By 1942, Britain was running out of space. The war was producing POWs faster than the British could house them, and every square foot of British territory was either being bombed, fortified, or used for the war effort. The British government sent an urgent request to Washington. Can you take 175,000 prisoners? The United States government was reluctant. America's involvement in World War I had been brief, and the military had virtually no experience managing large POW populations. There were concerns about security, about logistics, about the presence of enemy soldiers on American soil potentially causing panic among civilians. The U.S. military in 1939 had been only the 18th largest in the world, ranked below Romania. The country was still crawling out of the Great Depression. But the Geneva Conventions of 1929 provided clear guidelines, and America prided itself on following international law. So despite the reservations, the answer came back, yes. What followed was one of the most remarkable logistical operations of the war, one that's been largely forgotten by history. German POWs were typically shipped on Liberty ships returning from Europe. These remarkable vessels were themselves a testament to American industrial capacity. Built using revolutionary welding techniques instead of traditional riveting, they could be constructed in just over a month. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was famously built and launched in just 4 days and 15 hours. As many as 30,000 German prisoners arrived per month at ports in New York and Virginia. The journey across the Atlantic was dangerous. The prisoners faced the very real possibility of being sunk by their own U-boats. But for many, capture by the Americans or British was preferable to the alternative. Fear of Soviet captivity was widespread and justified. More than 1 million German POWs would die in Soviet camps. The treatment began immediately aboard ship. Gunter Grahl, who would later return to the United States to thank his former captors, recalled standing in a POW camp in 1944 trying to decide what to buy first at the camp store, ice cream or Coca-Cola. The last ice cream I had been able to buy in Germany was years ago, he wrote. But Coca-Cola? Never before. This was his introduction to America. Not punishment, not starvation, but ice cream and Coca-Cola. Once processed at the ports, the German prisoners were loaded onto trains for distribution to camps across the country. And this is where the first real shock hit many of them. They weren't packed into cattle cars. They weren't chained or beaten. Instead, they rode in Pullman cars, comfortable passenger trains with cushioned seats, windows, and amenities that many of these soldiers had never experienced even as free men. Hans Wecker, a former POW at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, who later became a physician in Maine, remembered that life in the camps represented a vast improvement for many Germans who had grown up in what he called cold water flats back home. But the real revelation came from the windows of those trains. Imagine being a German soldier in 1944. Your cities back home are being pounded into rubble by Allied bombing raids. Food is rationed to the point of starvation. Every factory, every resource, every ounce of productive capacity has been squeezed dry by the war effort. You've been told that America is suffering too, that the war is bringing the rich Americans to their knees. Then you look out the train window. Hour after hour, day after day, the landscape rolls past. And it's untouched. Farms sprawl across endless prairies. Factories pump out smoke from massive complexes. Small towns flash by with cars parked on every street. The buildings are intact. The bridges are standing. There are no bomb craters, no burned-out husks of buildings, no signs of deprivation whatsoever. One German POW later recalled the journey with a mixture of awe and dread. We traveled for 3 days, and the land just kept going. Factory after factory. Farm after farm. Everything working, everything whole. We began to understand that we could never win this war. The United States is roughly the size of the entire European continent. For German soldiers accustomed to the compressed geography of Europe, where you could cross several countries in a day's march, the sheer scale of America was incomprehensible. They would travel for 24 hours and still be in the same state. Theodore Gintz, who worked on farms east of the Missouri River, later reflected on one particular moment that struck him. He saw Americans on strike, walking picket lines with signs, protesting because the price of overalls had gone up a few cents. To him, this was astounding. That was unthinkable to us, that the workers would strike, he said. And I realized that this was only possible in a democracy. He also noted how American newspapers freely published photographs of American casualties from Pacific Island battles. In Germany, such transparency was unimaginable. The regime controlled all information. But here, in the enemy's homeland, the press was free to report both victories and losses. The psychological impact of this journey cannot be overstated. Many of these men had been fighting since 1939 or 1940. They'd conquered Poland, France, and large swaths of Russia. They'd been told they were the master race, that German industrial and military might was unstoppable, that the Americans were weak and divided. The train journey across America shattered those illusions in a way that no amount of propaganda could have reversed. By war's end, over 700 POW camps had been established across the United States, ranging from massive base camps that held thousands of prisoners to small branch camps that housed just a handful. About 155 base camps and 511 camps in total dotted the American landscape. The camps were primarily located in the South and Southwest, but they stretched from coast to coast. Texas alone hosted camps that held thousands of German prisoners. Colorado had 48 camps. Nebraska had facilities holding about 12,000 POWs. Florida, California, New York, nearly every state had some involvement. The War Department had clear orders. These camps were to comply with the Geneva Conventions. That meant adequate shelter, sufficient food, medical care, religious services, and opportunities for recreation and education. For many German POWs, this was better than they'd ever had in the German military. Consider the food. The official food ration in occupied Germany in 1947 varied between 1,040 and 1,550 calories per day. Back in Germany, civilians and soldiers alike were dealing with severe shortages. But in American POW camps, the prisoners ate well, sometimes better than American civilians who were dealing with rationing. One former prisoner recalled, "When I was captured, I weighed 128 pounds. After 2 years as an American POW, I weighed 185 pounds. I had gotten so fat you could no longer see my eyes. This led to complaints from some American civilians who felt that the Germans were being treated too well while American families made sacrifices. But the U.S. government had a strategic reason for this policy. Colonel A. M. Tollefson, Assistant Director of the POW Division of the Provost Marshal's Office, explained it bluntly. America intended to follow the rules to avoid giving even the semblance of an excuse to the enemy to violate the rights of American soldiers whom they hold as prisoners of war. The daily routine in the camps was structured but not harsh. A typical day might go like this: 6 a.m. wake-up call and morning roll call. 7 a.m. breakfast in communal dining halls. 7:30 a.m. work details begin. Prisoners who were assigned to agricultural work would be trucked out to farms. Those assigned to camp maintenance would begin their duties. 12 p.m. lunch break. Many prisoners who met their work quotas early could return to camp for the rest of the day. 5 p.m. work ends. Evening activities begin. 6 p.m. dinner. 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. recreation time. This is where things got interesting. The camps weren't just holding pens. They were, in effect, small German towns transplanted to American soil. The prisoners organized elaborate cultural and educational activities. They formed orchestras and theatrical groups. They played soccer and other sports. They held language classes. Many Germans used the time to learn English, mathematics, and other subjects that would serve them well after the war. Religious services were provided, with chaplains assigned to meet the prisoners' spiritual needs. Libraries were stocked with books. Some camps even screened movies. Alex Funk, who served as a military chaplain to fellow POWs at Camp Elgona, wrote, "We all were positively impressed by the U.S. and we all had been won over to friendly relations with Americans." But the camps weren't without tension. The prisoners themselves were a diverse group ideologically. Some were die-hard Nazis who remained fanatically loyal to Hitler. Others were apolitical conscripts who just wanted the war to end. Still others were actively opposed to the Nazi regime. American authorities monitored prisoner activities closely and separated known Nazi loyalists from others when possible. There were cases of violence within the camps. Nazi prisoners sometimes intimidated or even attacked those they deemed traitors to the cause. Yet despite these tensions, the prevailing atmosphere in most camps was one of relative calm. Security concerns occasionally arose, but escapes were remarkably rare. Of the more than 400,000 Axis prisoners held in the United States, only 2,222 attempted escape, less than 1%. Most were recaptured within a day. Why so few escape attempts? Part of it was the practical challenge. Where would you go? America was vast, and a German-speaking soldier with no money, no contacts, and no knowledge of the country had virtually no chance of successfully disappearing. The honor system was actually used in some camps. Prisoners were allowed outside the camp without guards based on their word that they would return. But there was another reason: many prisoners simply didn't want to escape. Life in the camps was better than what they'd face in war-torn Europe. While the German prisoners adapted to camp life, they couldn't help but notice the massive industrial operation unfolding around them. This is where the story becomes truly remarkable, because these prisoners had front-row seats to the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. Let's put some numbers on the table. In May 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for the production of 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping within 2 years. Adolf Hitler was told by his advisors that this was American propaganda. They assured him it was impossible. In 1939, annual aircraft production for the U.S. military was less than 3,000 planes. The American military ranked 39th in the world, behind countries like Romania. The U.S. had horses pulling its artillery. Hitler's advisors were catastrophically wrong. By the end of the war, American factories had produced 300,000 aircraft. By 1944, the United States was producing 2/3 of all Allied military equipment. Let me repeat that, 2/3 of all Allied equipment, weapons used not just by America, but by Britain, the Soviet Union, and every other Allied nation. The statistics are almost incomprehensible. 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. In just 3 years following the Battle of Midway, Japan built 6 aircraft carriers. The United States built 17. America launched more vessels in 1941 alone than Japan produced during the entire war. In 1944, the United States built more planes than Japan did from 1939 to 1945 combined. By war's end, more than half of all industrial production in the entire world was taking place in the United States. The German POWs witnessed this firsthand. They worked in factories. They labored on farms that fed the workers in those factories. They saw the trucks delivering materials, the trains hauling finished products, the cargo ships being loaded at ports. Consider Mobile, Alabama. In 1940, Gulf Shipbuilding had 240 employees. By 1943, it had 11,600. Alabama Dry Dock went from 1,000 workers to almost 30,000. The city transformed almost overnight from a sleepy southern port to one of the busiest shipping and shipbuilding centers in the nation. This pattern repeated across the country. Detroit, already the motor capital of America, converted its automotive plants to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles. The Willow Run bomber plant, designed by the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn, was the largest factory ever built at the time. Its assembly line was over a mile long, producing B-24 bombers at a rate that would have seemed like science fiction just years earlier. Henry Kaiser revolutionized shipbuilding by using welding instead of riveting, allowing Liberty ships to be constructed in record time. His factories achieved the astonishing feat of building and launching a complete ship in just over 4 days. The United States gross national product grew by 52% between 1939 and 1944. Industrial output tripled. And here's the kicker: consumer spending actually increased during this time. America was the only combatant nation where civilian consumption rose during the war. For the German prisoners watching this unfold, the implications were devastating. Back in Germany, every resource had been ruthlessly extracted for the war effort. Civilians were starving. Cities were being bombed to rubble. Industry was being systematically destroyed by Allied air raids. But in America, the war machine churned out weapons and vehicles and planes in quantities that defied imagination, and Americans were simultaneously living better than they had before the war. One German prisoner remarked, "We had been told that the Americans were soft, that their will would break, that they couldn't produce enough to matter. But when you see it with your own eyes, factory after factory, running day and night, producing more in a week than we could make in months, you understand. You understand that we lost this war before it even began." The Geneva Conventions allowed POWs to be assigned to work, as long as it wasn't directly related to military operations and they were paid for their labor. The United States faced a critical labor shortage. Millions of young American men were overseas fighting, and farms and factories desperately needed workers. German POWs filled that void. They were paid 80 cents per day, roughly equivalent to the pay of an American private. In 1943, the government estimated that prisoner labor cost 50 to 75% of normal free labor. While prisoners generally worked more slowly than civilians, their work was reliable and available on demand in exactly the numbers needed. The work assignments varied. Some prisoners worked in canneries and mills. Others were assigned to forestry or construction. But the majority went to farms, and this is where some of the most interesting stories emerge. By the peak harvest season of 1943, Texas alone had a shortage of over 300,000 workers. German prisoners chopped cotton, harvested fruit in the Rio Grande Valley, cut sugar cane, and tended fields all over the state. In Nebraska, POWs harvested beets. The first year, the yield averaged about 1.5 tons per man per day. By 1945, with improved training and supervision, the average rose to 4 tons. In Florida's citrus groves, former members of Rommel's Afrika Korps, some of the toughest German soldiers, picked oranges. Each prisoner was assigned a ladder, a picking bag, and 30 boxes to fill, each holding up to 100 pounds of citrus. Working hours were from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., or until the daily quota was reached. Many of the prisoners initially resisted agricultural work. They were soldiers, after all, not farm laborers. But they quickly adapted when they realized they could rest for the remainder of the day once they met their quotas. The prisoners were provided bread, tea, and an unlimited supply of oranges during work hours, more fresh fruit than many had seen in years. The relationship between German POWs and American farmers was often surprisingly warm. It wasn't unusual for a prisoner to eat lunch with the farm family. Prisoners gave farmers handmade gifts, carved wooden items, drawings, crafts they'd made in their spare time. Some friendships lasted well past the end of the war, with American farmers sending care packages to Germany and even acting as official sponsors for former POWs immigrating to the United States. Kelly Holthus, 76, from York, Nebraska, recalled, "I had the impression the prisoners were happy to be out of the war." Many were. At Camp San Augustine in Texas, a POW named Otto Rinkenauer fell in love with a local girl, Amelia Keidel. After the war, he returned from Germany, and they were married. They built Keidel's Motel in San Augustine, which still stands today. In one remarkable case, a farmer who died many years after the war left his farm to his former German POW worker. But not all interactions were positive. There were instances of hostility and suspicion, especially in areas with strong anti-German sentiment. Security concerns occasionally arose. And there was an uncomfortable truth that some noticed. Black American soldiers, including Rupert Trimingham, noted that German prisoners could visit restaurants that they could not because of Jim Crow laws. Enemy soldiers had more freedom in some American towns than African American servicemen. Still, for tens of thousands of German prisoners, working American farms provided a revelation. They saw firsthand how American agriculture operated: mechanized, efficient, abundant. They saw farmers who owned their own land, made their own decisions, and prospered from their labor. This was dramatically different from what they'd known in Germany. The work was hard but fair. The pay was modest, but it existed. And critically, the prisoners could see the fruits of their labor contributing to something larger, an economy that functioned, that produced surplus, that allowed people to live with dignity. These experiences would have profound effects when these men returned to Germany after the war. The United States government understood that these prisoners would eventually return to Germany, and they would carry their experiences with them. So a deliberate effort was made to reshape how these men thought about democracy, capitalism, and the future. Education programs were established in many camps. Prisoners took classes in U.S. history, geography, and government. They learned about the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the principles of democratic governance. Films were shown highlighting the benefits of free enterprise and individual liberty. The program had an obvious long-term objective. These men would exert powerful influence on German public opinion during the peace to come. An exit poll of 22,153 POWs conducted by the Provost Marshal General's office showed that 74% of the prisoners left the United States with an appreciation of democracy and a friendly attitude toward their captors. But the most effective education didn't come from classes or films. It came from living in America, seeing how the system actually worked. Theodore Gintz observed workers on strike and realized that such freedom was only possible in a democracy. German prisoners read American newspapers that freely published criticism of government policies and photographs of American casualties. They saw that dissent was not only permitted but protected. They witnessed a society where hard work was rewarded, where social mobility was possible, where a poor immigrant like William Knudsen could rise from being a dock worker to becoming CEO of General Motors and then lead the nation's industrial mobilization effort. They saw women working in factories, not as drudgery but as empowered workers earning wages and contributing to society. They saw racial tensions and acknowledged America's imperfections, but they also saw a system that at least claimed to aspire to equality and justice. Many prisoners expressed mixed feelings about returning to Germany. Their cities lay in ruins. Food was scarce. The political future was uncertain. Some had developed such appreciation for American culture that they wished to stay, though that wasn't an option, at least not immediately. Repatriation was completed by 1946. But the experiences of these POWs left a lasting impression on those who had interacted with them. And for many former prisoners, their time in the United States shaped their post-war perspectives fundamentally. Consider the correspondence that developed after the war. The Luetchens, a family in Nebraska who had employed German POW farmhands, established a lively letter exchange with their former workers. They sent food and clothing to Germany. Eventually, they visited some of them in Germany. Recently, one of the family members reflected on those experiences in the context of current controversies about detention facilities. It was less scary then, he concluded, but he expressed hope for understanding others, even designated enemies. When you know people as human beings up close and understand about their lives, it really alters your view of people and the view of your own world. Gunter Graum made a bike trip back to the United States decades later specifically to thank America for the treatment he'd received, treatment he knew he would not have received at the hands of other captors. With all the trouble in the Middle East, there are so many things happening, he said in 2017. I think of the prisoners of ISIS. They won't get ice cream or Coca-Cola. My stay here was the best treatment I've had. The contrast with American POWs held in Germany, or German POWs held by the Soviets, couldn't have been starker. More than 1 million German POWs died in Soviet captivity. American soldiers held in German camps endured harsh conditions, though those in Luftwaffe-run camps generally fared better than those held by the SS or in Eastern camps. The German POWs in America were, by any objective measure, extraordinarily fortunate. And they knew it. As the war wound down in the spring of 1945, small branch camps began funneling their prisoners to larger camps in preparation for repatriation. But the process wasn't simple. General Lucius Clay, the American general in charge of German post-war occupation, didn't want to see 400,000 healthy German POWs return immediately to Central Europe. American farmers didn't want them to leave either. The labor was invaluable. But labor unions demanded their departure to make jobs available for returning U.S. soldiers. President Harry S. Truman, characteristically blunt, simply ordered the War Department to ship them out to whichever Allied country wanted them. Consequently, most German POWs spent the next 2 to 3 years in the less friendly hands of the French and British before finally returning to Germany. When they did return, they found a nation in ruins. Industrial output in 1947 was only 1/3 of its 1938 level. 20% of all housing had been destroyed. Food production per capita was roughly half of what it had been before the war. The official food ration was below starvation levels. But these returning POWs carried something valuable: knowledge. They'd seen a functioning democracy. They'd witnessed an economic system that produced abundance. They'd experienced fair treatment under the rule of law. They understood that another way was possible. Many of these former prisoners became advocates for democratic reforms in post-war Germany. They influenced their communities, their families, their colleagues. They helped build the foundation for what would become the German economic miracle, the rapid recovery and growth that transformed West Germany into an economic powerhouse by the 1960s. It's impossible to quantify exactly how much influence these 400,000 men had on Germany's transformation. But historians agree it was significant. The POWs who returned from America were among the most vocal supporters of democratic institutions, free markets, and close ties with the United States. In a very real sense, the POW camps in America were an accidental but effective tool of post-war reconstruction. By treating prisoners humanely, by exposing them to American society, and by demonstrating that democracy could produce prosperity, the United States helped plant the seeds for a democratic Germany.